This is The Right Approach. We're your hosts. I'm J.W. Judge, and with me is Barbara Hinsky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Dan Wells, the New York Times best-selling author, best known for his horror series, I Am Not a Serial Killer, which has been made into a movie and means that I'm the only person on this podcast who hasn't had a story turned into a movie yet. I'll say yet. There's hope. He has authored numerous other books, co-hosts two podcasts that I tune into every single week with Writing Excuses and Intentionally Blank. Dan, welcome to The Right Approach.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's I've got like 4 hours worth of questions that we'll try and cram into like 30 minutes here.
Yeah, I'll give short yet informative answers.
And I've got to say, I didn't have this on my little script here. Your about page on your website is my favorite about page of anybody ever.
I agree.
Because I thought, I was coming up with all my questions ahead of time, and I looked at that and I was like, well, dadgum, I should just go through this about line by line and ask all the questions I have.
Yeah, I built that when I first got published like 14 years ago. And it's interesting because half the people say, like you, this is a very informative about page, and half the people who read it say, wow, this is really out of date, isn't it?
Oh, I don't care. It's all the food items and movies
Yes.
and music and all that. That's just,
Love that.
it's just a little bit extra.
Yeah, we feel like we know you.
I might be the only adult that lists his favorite animals on his website, but
well, I like it.
I do
All right.
too.
So I know that you are coming to this interview right off of the heels of Comic-Con in New York. And so I appreciate you being here because let me ask it this way. After an event like that, do you feel energized, or do you want to go find the most secluded mountain in Utah and not see another human for several days?
Typically when I come home from a convention, I am very burned out. I have a limited number of extrovert points and I have to spend them all to get through a convention. In this case, I was only at Comic-Con one day, and that was Friday, which is several days ago. So while I have been in Manhattan and surrounded by people, the nice thing about New York City is that it is a very lonely kind of crowded, where you can be very insular and not have to actually interact with people other than avoiding cars. And so I'm actually fairly energized right now. I've been working all morning. I'm excited to work in the afternoon. So yeah. But yes, from a typical convention where I'm there 3 or 4 days and in my booth selling books the whole time, I absolutely have to crash when I get home.
So kind of in general terms, because this podcast is for all kinds of authors, what kind of effect do you see in your author business when you attend conferences? Are there tangible, like aside from you sell books there and meet people, do you see tangible like effects on the big business?
I actually don't pay attention to my numbers as much as most authors do, and as much as I probably should. And that is something that my wife and business manager is now trying to correct. But yeah, I don't actually know, because I kind of purposefully don't pay attention to that kind of stuff. It may well be that going to a convention boosts sales in the area or something, or maybe tweeting about a convention will get more interaction online. I don't know, because that is not the part of this business that interests me. And thus far, I've had enough success that I have been able to get away with ignoring that. That said, my wife is better at this than I am, and she is starting to pay much closer attention to those kinds of data.
Well, I can appreciate ignoring the aspects of it that you don't care for, because I do my own bookkeeping and I just don't like it. And so I really haven't done any of it for about the last 6 months. And now it's gotten to the point where I'm dreading it so much and know that it's so backed up that I continue to push it off and make it worse. Um, have you noticed any significant difference in what events look like now compared to pre-COVID, or have things gotten kind of back to normal?
So New York Comic Con, and then last week FanX, which is Salt Lake's Comic Con. Those are the first two I have done in 3 years that have really felt like themselves again. I've done a handful of other shows, not as many as I typically do, but it does kind of feel like things are getting back to normal a little bit, which on the one hand is great. And on the other hand, frightens me because medically speaking, we are not back to normal.
Yeah.
You know, COVID has already killed more people this year than last year, and we're not even at the end of the year yet. So it's still a big deal. And I wear a mask everywhere and I try to be incredibly cautious, but at the same time, we can't hide in holes forever. We have to start, I have to sell books, and this is a good way to sell books. So yeah, I'm torn about it.
Yeah, I understand that. I am flying to San Diego in a few weeks, and I think that's the first time I'm going to have been on a plane since, I don't know, maybe even 2019. I can't recall, but I can identify with that.
Yeah, it's been difficult. Oh, sorry, what were you gonna say, Barbara?
No, I'm just agreeing with you both. It's a little daunting.
It is. It's hard to get back into it. Airplanes still frighten me a lot more than conventions do, which sucks because going to a convention typically involves at least 2 airplanes and a couple of airports. And but like I said, we can't hide in holes forever, as much as I would love to. Literally sitting here in my pajamas in my home office, this is the hole I love to hide in. So I'm very glad we can, one thing that I do love about the pandemic, if that's not a horrible way of phrasing it, is that it has taught us how to do things digitally and remotely.
Yes.
We have had the technology for this for years, and it wasn't until a pandemic forced us to get off our butts and start taking advantage of it. We can do so much of this kind of interaction that we never used to do, and I'm really glad that we have been forced to advance in that way.
Yeah, same. This is actually my second podcast that I've had. The first one I started weeks after I started at the end of March in 2020, because there was a nonfiction book idea I had for lawyers that I'd wanted to do for, I think, probably 18 months, that involved doing a bunch of interviews. But the introvert in me had never taken the step to do that. And so I thought, well, I will force myself into it by doing a podcast and inviting people to come on and talk about these topics that I have in mind, and ended up doing that for 2.5 years. But if I hadn't had that break where everything in my litigation practice was just at a standstill for a while, then I don't think I would have done it. And so I agree. As terrible as so much of it has been, it has also given us some opportunities that we wouldn't have reached out for otherwise.
Yeah, it's been nice.
All right. So one of the things that when I sent y'all an email and had you come on, that I wanted to talk about is that you were very open about your religious beliefs. And on this podcast, we've talked about me being a deacon in my church here in Alabama. So how does your worldview, your belief system affect what you are willing to write about?
That is a good way of phrasing it. Because one thing I try to do is to not get preachy in my books. I try not to let my religious beliefs affect what I do write about. But at the same time, it absolutely does affect what I'm not willing to write about. And at the risk of getting very specifically Christian for a moment, there are specific, like, I write about murder. I write horror books and I write about murder. I don't commit murder, but I do write about murder, and there is a qualitative difference there. Whereas, for example, something like sex, I don't like writing about that. One of the things that it says in the New Testament is, don't even think about committing adultery with somebody. And so there's a specific difference has been stated between the act and thinking about the act, and so that does change things. I try not to put a bunch of vulgar language in my books, that sort of thing. That said, I can always, in hindsight, go back through my books and find my beliefs are shining through them. Not always in obvious ways. People who are not members of my church might not notice them, but I can notice them in hindsight, in a way that I think influences the characters and influences the themes in the stories without being a big preachy soapbox.
I want to jump into this because I find this very interesting and intriguing. I write women's fiction and sweet Christmas stories and some mystery thriller stuff. So, and I've, as a retired lawyer, I'm retired now, just write full time, but I'm a lawyer and was corporate lawyer. So I always have some sort of financial fraud, some kind of stuff going on, embezzlement, all that kind of stuff. So I have bad guys and I have mobsters, and they don't swear. And so, because my readers don't want to read bad language, and I don't particularly want to write it. In women's fiction, particularly romance, there's the thing about how spicy is your book, how many chili peppers. Well, I always like to say my books are kind of no salt added, the version, because there's none of that stuff. But it is a writerly task to make your bad guys and your mobsters realistic when they don't swear and they don't do some of these things that, and I guess in real life they do. And my goodness, if you watch any television whatsoever, it's really off the charts with that. So how do you approach that? I'm particularly on the language thing. I mean, I've used symbols to indicate swearing. What do you do?
Well, it is difficult. I do like to reflect the world accurately as much as possible. And this is the same thing you're talking about, that if I'm writing about a specific type of person who, because of their career or their choices or just their background or personality, they would do or say things that I would never do or say. In some cases, I get away with that by using different languages. I'm fluent in Spanish. I use a lot of fairly vulgar Spanish. I used to live in Mexico, picked up a lot of words. So my cyberpunk YA series, they speak a lot of Spanish, and there's some foul language in there that most people don't notice because it's all in Spanish. And so that is one way that I get around this. Others, I don't know. I try to, I guess that chili pepper analogy that you used is a good one. There are, words that are maybe halfway up that chili pepper scale that I will allow myself to use strategically in order to, create the right moment or represent a character, but they're not going to be in every single sentence the way you would see them for like you said on a TV show.
Yeah. If it's in the Bible, I figure I can use it.
There you go. Well, and this is not, I think, limited to books either. This is something that you see all the time. One thing that was always, for example, I was a big fan of Breaking Bad, which was on the FX, and FX is not a full-blown cable HBO get away with anything kind of network. They were allowed one F word per season. and they used it very strategically. And it was almost a game online for people to be waiting and say, okay, it's season 4 now. Where's the one F-bomb they're allowed to use? When is that going to come out? And so, yeah, every artist, regardless of religion, has to make these kinds of decisions because of the audience that they're going to, because of the medium that they are working in. And it is frustrating, I think, on both sides. People who don't want to have that kind of stuff in their media, people who wish there was more of it in their media. And ultimately, the answer comes down to creators have to create what they're comfortable with. Yeah. Readers and viewers and audiences are more than welcome to find the media that they are comfortable with and that resonates with them. And that's one of the reasons that we need to support art as much as possible so that there is something out there for everybody.
So I think this is a related topic, and maybe it's not. I know it took you a while to land in the horror genre, which is when your writing career really took off. Can you talk about whether there was anything that particularly kept you from writing horror sooner, and what eventually prompted you to write in that genre?
I wasn't avoiding horror. I just grew up reading fantasy and thought that I was a fantasy author. And now 15 years into my career, I am finally getting to the point where I am writing fantasy novels. The first 5 books that I wrote when I was trying to break in as an author were mostly fantasy. But I found that what I enjoyed writing was the darker side of that. And so whereas like the first one was just overt epic fantasy, that the next one was a slightly darker fantasy, and the next one after that slightly darker again. The 5th one that I wrote, and these are all speaking of my unpublished books, was essentially just a historical horror novel. And that was kind of the key transition that I needed to just say, you know what, I'm going to write a modern horror novel and see how I like it. And it just felt very comfortable and very, as creepy as this sounds with a book about supernatural serial killers, it felt like coming home. It was the most natural voice and tone that I had ever found. And I enjoyed that process a lot. I do tend to like spooky, creepy stuff like that. I am not really a slasher movie fan, but I am absolutely a suspense and paranoia thriller fan. And so, and very much a supernatural monster aficionado. And so it wasn't that I was avoiding horror. It's just that it took me a while to find my stride. And that happened to be in a genre that I never expected to be writing in.
See, so I write dark fantasy and enjoyed the darker side of things as well. And it took me a while to get there, but for a different and I guess more personal reason, in that in high school, I started doing some creative writing. And this was back in I guess, the late 90s. So post Columbine. And I had left one of my journals laying around, and somebody picked it up and found it and got concerned. And so then things like escalated to the principal being involved and like the school administrator. And so, after that, I didn't write anything that explored the darker side of anything for a long time. And it took me a long time to come back to that. I mean, I'm 40 now, and it wasn't until 2020 that I wrote my first novel, and it has, there's kidnapping and murder and killing and all sorts of mayhem. And I had, my parents read it, a couple of people in my church read it, some other people who have the same worldviews as me read it. So I could say, hey, it is a little bit dark, and I need to know, if I'm a member of your church and you know that this is me writing it, does that give you any concern or whatever? And everybody who read it was okay with it. And so I have just leaned into that as I've written the second and third and now the fourth one. And but that was my own experience there of I got some blowback early on about that interest in the darker side of things. And it took a long time to come around on that.
Yeah, and that's an unfortunate thing and very bad timing. I remember right in the wake of Columbine, people got very concerned about that. But and I can absolutely see where those educators were coming from, right? They were trying to protect you, they were trying to protect other people, they were terrified, not of you, but terrified of, evil potential that had started to become more evident in the world and in children. Adults have always been hyper protective of children. I remember seeing an interview it was on the Colbert Report years and years and years ago. Neil Gaiman had just published his book Coraline, which is this, kind of like this very dark, spooky Alice in Wonderland portal fantasy kind of story. And was it? No, it was the Graveyard Book, because I remember that Colbert read the first line of the book, which was "The hand in the darkness held a knife," and he said, "You're writing for kids. Why are you putting all this dark, spooky stuff into a book for kids? What happened to Peter Rabbit?" And Gaiman gave his own answer to that question, which was much more diplomatic than what I was screaming at the TV, which is, "Have you not read Peter Rabbit? It is full of murder, and the farmer wants to catch Peter Rabbit and kill him and eat him."
Yeah.
It is an incredibly dark book, but it is presented in this very cute, kind of cuddly way with all those adorable Beatrix Potter illustrations. And so we don't tend to think of it as dark as it is. Children's literature has always been dark. The Grimm's fairy tales are shockingly dark.
Horrible.
And we always think that kids are not ready for the kinds of things that kids are absolutely ready for. And that actually is what Gaiman said in his response, was that he gets letters from adults all the time asking him why he is putting all this creepy stuff and telling him that children aren't ready for it. He has never once gotten a letter from a child complaining about that sort of thing, because they're a lot more ready to deal with darkness than we wish they were. And I think actually fiction and art is an incredibly safe and creative and productive way for children to deal with things that frighten them. It is so much better for a kid to be writing dark stories about kidnappings and murder, like you're talking about, than to, go out and do those things for real. Obviously, that's a stupid example and a stupid way of phrasing it, but we forget that art is such a powerful way of exploring your own emotions and your own fears in a safe environment. It's getting in a roller coaster, pulling down that roller bar, and then that you can experience all of these fears and thrills and dangers without actually ever being in danger. And that helps us to be able to process those emotions more effectively in real life. I think that one of the greatest things about books is the ability for a kid to read something they're not quite ready to read yet, because it helps them to grow up, it helps them to learn about things, and it helps them to learn about themselves. Children are so much better at policing their own media than we give them credit for. And I think that we need to really support kids in the kinds of art that they want to consume and create.
I think that's really great. All right, I want to turn to a little bit of a different topic here. I know that a significant portion of your readership is south of the United States, in Spanish-speaking countries.
Yeah.
How did that develop?
Yeah.
Well, again, getting back to the religion thing, I served a religious mission for my church. I lived in Mexico for 2 years, and I speak the language very well. I actually speak it much better now than I did when I lived there. Um, and so on that, combined with some very good timing, the YA science fiction market happened to really explode in South America right about the time that the Partial series was coming out. And so I was one of the first big names to get in there, or I should say more correctly, one of the first names to get into that market and then get big. I am much more popular in South America than I am in the United States. I should say in Latin America, because this includes Mexico as well. Mexico, Bolivia, and Argentina are the only places where I will get recognized on the street. And I don't know if that's still the case, but it certainly was back when I was traveling there 3 years ago.
So, and the hat helps, right?
The hat helps a lot. And that's one of the reasons that I wear it, so that I can take it off and become invisible. But yeah, that kind of really good timing. My books happened to get into the market right as it was growing. I caught the wave right at the perfect time. And then the ability to speak Spanish fluently, to interact with fans. I've taught writing classes there. I've been on TV. I've been on the radio. I've done all kinds of stuff. I can do these kinds of remote things, so that I can do talks down in South and Central and Latin America. And it's been a really great relationship. I love those countries. I love the people who live there so much. And I'm really grateful that they have kind of embraced my books.
I know you've talked about having lived in Germany as well. Have you had any of that similar success in European countries?
Germany for a while was my biggest market. All 6 of my John Cleaver serial killer novels have been national bestsellers in Germany. And to lesser extent, that has extended into France and some of the surrounding areas. I've gone to Hungary on book tours a couple of times and absolutely love it. It isn't quite at the level that Latin America is for me, but it's the one market in which I could go to, at the height of the series popularity, I could go to a bookstore and there would be, posters created by the bookstore about my books, things like that. They have, if you remember back in the 90s, we had those Read library posters, 80s and 90s, and just every celebrity would show up in them, and they were just dozens and dozens of these. There was a bookstore chain in Germany that did an ad campaign a few years ago that was something along the lines of, for 30 minutes I was, and then fill in the blank, and they would have a picture of a person holding a book, and like, for 30 minutes I was a superhero, I was a wizard, I was a whatever, and one of those, part of their ad campaign was, for 30 minutes I was a serial killer, which is terrible. But also there was a picture of a lady holding my book, and it was really fun to be included in that. I never have achieved, and probably never will, that kind of cultural penetration in the United States, and that's fine with me. But it's fun to have all of these kind of overseas markets and be able to interact with those people.
How did you open up to those markets? Did your publisher do all that, or did your agent sell your foreign rights? How did that come to pass?
My agent, her name is Sarah Crow. She's absolutely wonderful, and I've been with her since the beginning. She actually, before she was a full-time acquiring agent herself, when she was just an assistant working in the agency, she specialized to some degree in international taxes, helping authors figure out, that side of the money and the business. Yeah. And so what that meant is that she had a lot of good connections, and she had a lot of good people that she already knew and could work with, and a really good knowledge of the industry. And so a huge chunk, I would say a predominant chunk of my business has always been international, in part just because that's one of her many areas of expertise.
Wow.
All right. So shortly after we booked this interview with you, you announced that you were becoming an employee again for the first time in a long time.
Yes.
And you were becoming the vice president of narrative at Dragonsteel, which is probably one of the coolest titles I've ever heard. I think from context, like I can guess what that means, but what does that mean?
So Dragonsteel Entertainment, that is Brandon Sanderson's company. He's one of the biggest fantasy authors in the world, and he's one of my best friends. I've known him for 20 plus years, long before either of us were published. We went to college together, did all kinds of stuff. So his company, because he is so popular, because he has so many fans, he has his own convention now. He, is publishing his own books. He has done the biggest Kickstarter of all time. It's basically getting big enough that he can't keep up with the volume of storytelling he needs to produce. And it's very important to him and to the rest of the company to keep a focus on storytelling. And that ultimately is what made me say yes to this position, but we're getting ahead a little bit. It would be very easy for Brandon to just become a full-time merchandise production factory and put out, a million things that are connected to the books but aren't themselves actually books. And he does do a lot of that kind of stuff, and people love it. But he realized that he wanted to keep the focus on stories, and he wanted to do that without slowing down or without making people wait. And the way he phrased it is that he realized he needed another him. And so he approached me about the idea. We had already done a couple of co-writing collaborations. None of them are published yet. They were mostly just, let's see if we like working together. There was one that was a YA science fiction novel called The Apocalypse Guard that he wrote a draft of, and it didn't work, and he gave it to me, and I wrote a new draft of it, and it still didn't work. It was a very, very weird story that we haven't found the right angle on yet. And then he had another book called Dark One. He produced a graphic novel of Dark One. The premise of this is that it's basically a portal fantasy. Imagine that Narnia is real, but instead of being the prophesied king who will save everyone, the boy who travels there is the prophesied villain who will destroy everyone. And so they all want to kill him first before he gets a chance to do that. That graphic novel has been out for a couple of years. He really wanted to do a novel of it and just didn't have time in his schedule. And so he asked me if I would write, based on his outline, a novel. And I did. And both of us looked at it and realized that we really liked it. We liked where it came from. We liked where it went. We liked the process of working together. And he just suggested, well, why don't we formalize this? Do you want to just come into the fold and write books with me and for me full time? And I said yes. So I will still be doing my own stuff. This is not a great time for me to abandon my own books because there's a lot of exciting things happening with the Dan Wells business. But I will also be writing books with him. We will be doing a lot of co-written stuff. I'll be producing some short stories and novellas and stuff that are related to his books, that are part of the Cosmere, which is his giant connected universe, things like that. The very first of those collaborations is an audio series that should come out very early in the year. January is the current plan. That might change. It's changed a few times already. but that's called Dark One Forgotten, which is kind of a prequel to that story. And it feels weird to phrase it that way because the book isn't out yet, but the graphic novel is. So if you've read the graphic novel, this is a prequel to it. And it's done in the style of a fake podcast. Girl in college is kind of doing her own amateur investigation into a strange missing persons case, and over the course of the 6 episodes uncovers a supernatural serial killer. An evil villain from that magical world has traveled into ours. And so it's audio native because it is framed as if you were listening to this girl's podcast that she makes in her dorm room. And it was a lot of fun to write. I have a lot of experience writing scripts and that sort of thing. And so this was just a really great project for that. And that they're recording this week. I think they start today. So we should have that fully recorded and mastered and ready to go in January. But again, we'll see.
That sounds like a really cool story structure idea. I don't know if you're familiar with Sylvain Neuvel's trilogy that he wrote that started with a book called Sleeping Giants, but it's all audio logs and interviews is the structure. And I thought that it was a really compelling, it's a science fiction story. It was a really compelling way to write that. And it, I feel like it's one of those things that could either go really well or really poorly. And it went really well.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one specifically, but I do love that genre of, almost like a found footage movie. And you see that in fiction sometimes, whether it is an epistolary novel where the entire thing is letters that are being written, or a collection of real world artifacts, documents, and that sort of thing. And then in audio like this, where it's various audio clips that have been found. I think that's a really fun way to frame a story. And it was a lot of fun to do this one.
So I am a lawyer working full time and writing in the wee morning hours. And you have previously been, full-time employed and also writing. Have you had to relearn how to allocate your time for your own projects, or have you been able to kind of rely on reestablishing habits that you already had previously?
I am still in the transition process. It's only been 2 weeks since I've been officially full-time working for Dragonsteel. The biggest adjustment first, I know the time management is coming, but I've been kicking that can down the road while I first try to remember how to have coworkers, because I haven't had coworkers for 14 years. And so it's been very disconcerting. I'm only in the office 2 days a week. But even then, I have to really kind of force myself to not hide in my office because I'm so accustomed to being in this office, and I close the door. My kids don't bother me. And, half my kids have never known, more than half my kids have never known a dad who wasn't full-time at home working. And so it's just very normal for them. And then I go into this office and I keep thinking to myself, oh, I can't go out because there's all those people there and I don't want to have to interact with people. And then I have to change my thinking and say, no, that's why I'm in the office, is because personal interaction is valuable. So I'm remote 3 days and in person 2 days and still getting my head around it. It was a huge group of Dragonsteel people that all went to New York Comic Con together. And I'm very out of practice traveling with people. I'm so accustomed to traveling alone, being completely solo. Last night, flying home, I went through the JFK security line, which is a nightmare of its own, and then immediately took off and found the gate and got there. And, a couple of the other people were like, did you lose that person you were with? And I'm like, oh, crap. I should have waited at the security line for this person to follow me. And it's just, I'm still getting my head around that kind of community sense that I haven't really had to deal with in a while. And I'm not complaining about it. I do see value in it. It's just I'm out of practice. I've got to remind myself that I need to talk to people occasionally.
Yeah.
Well, I have really enjoyed this conversation, and it's been really interesting to talk to you after having listened to you for several years. And so I appreciate all that you do for writers, um, particularly with writing excuses, with the books you produce, um, but also with the entertainment value that Intentionally Blank is. I've really enjoyed that over the last couple of years. I want to make sure before we go that people know where to find you and your work.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you. I have also enjoyed this. Very nice to meet you both and talk to you. Um, so the best place to find me is my website, thedanwells.com. Go visit that. It's kind of crappy right now because we're in the middle of rebuilding it. But what you should be able to do is subscribe to my newsletter. And more than anything else that I do, my newsletter is the way to stay in touch with where I am and what I'm doing and what I'm reading right now, what I'm writing right now, and all of that. I do have a social media presence, but I hate social media deeply, and so I am very rarely on it. The Dan Wells, once again, is the place to find me on Twitter. I think my Instagram is called Dan Wells Author or Author Dan Wells. I don't actually know because I don't do Instagram. My assistant does Instagram for me because I hate social media. But also, Writing Excuses and Intentionally Blank are the two podcasts that I do, and those are the other two really great ways of finding me. So sign up for my newsletter, look up the podcasts. That'll get you everything that you need.
And Dan, I want to jump in. I thought your website was great. And I
Oh,
look
well, thank you
forward to
very
reading
much.
it. Yeah, I thought it's as we were talking at the beginning of the podcast, your website, and as you talk about yourself, is the most engaging, original. It's wonderful. It's perfect. Everybody
Thank you.
listening should go check that out. You'll enjoy it.
Thank you very much.